I discovered that my boyfriend of 4 years had been secretly using the banking password I once gave him for a one-time favor to siphon $17,000 from my savings account into his failing restaurant. My name is Natalie Okonkwo, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. The fraud alert came in just after lunch, while I was sitting at my desk pretending to work through a spreadsheet I had already read 3 times without absorbing a single line. At first, I thought the notification was one of those routine security messages the bank sent whenever I made an online purchase that looked slightly unusual. A lot of people in my life treated me like I was paranoid because I kept my banking alerts turned on for everything, but I had learned early that the easiest way to catch a mistake was to notice it immediately. I kept notifications for card purchases, transfers, withdrawals, logins, password changes, the whole thing. It took maybe 10 seconds to glance at my phone and know whether something needed attention. This one needed attention. The message said there had been a large transfer out of my savings account and asked me to confirm whether I had authorized it. The amount was not small. It was enough to make my stomach tighten before I even opened the app. I remember staring at the number, then at the name of the destination account, then back at the number, as if the display might change if I looked at it hard enough. I had not made that transfer. My first assumption was simple and familiar. Somebody had gotten into my account. I work in operations for a logistics company, so I spend a lot of my day around details, procedures, and systems. The kind of person who thinks through all the possible failure points before sending an email is not exactly the kind of person who shrugs off a bank alert. I immediately locked my card through the app and called the fraud line. After enough automated menus to make my jaw clench, I finally reached a representative and explained that a transfer had been made from my savings account without my permission. The representative asked the standard questions first. Had I shared my login credentials with anyone? Had I recently clicked any suspicious links? Had I left my phone unattended? Had I changed devices? Had I traveled? I answered carefully because I knew the answers mattered. Yes, I had once shared my online banking password with someone. No, I had not recently changed devices. No, I had not clicked anything strange. No, I had not traveled. The representative went quiet for a moment, then told me the transfer had been authorized using my own online banking password. I actually laughed at first, because the words made no sense together. That's not possible, I said. It appears the login credentials used match the account holder's password, she replied in the calm voice. People use when they are delivering information that could make someone scream. I asked her to repeat herself. She did, slightly more slowly this time, as if she thought I had not understood the phrase, when what I had really failed to understand was how my own password could possibly have been used by someone else. I sat there stunned, listening while she read back the transfer details and the timestamp. The bank could see that the transfer had come from a device and connection that had authenticated properly. It was not one of those random hacking situations where someone brute forces a login from across the world. Whoever had done it had entered my password exactly as the system expected. That should have narrowed things down immediately, but my brain resisted the most obvious conclusion, because the obvious conclusion was too ugly. I had only shared that password once, nearly a year earlier. It had not even been a dramatic or intimate moment. I had been trying to help my boyfriend, Bennett, log in to a streaming account on my laptop because he had forgotten his own password and wanted to show me a documentary before dinner. While he was waiting, he had joked that I was the only person he knew who remembered all her passwords. I had laughed and told him that was because I kept them organized, unlike certain people I could name. At some point after that, he had needed access to something else on my computer, and I had given him my banking password so he could verify an issue while I was away from the desk. I remembered doing it because it had felt harmless at the time. It had been one of those convenience moments that couples sometimes stumble into, where you are juggling groceries, work emails, dinner plans, and a phone call, and you think, this is fine, this is temporary, I will change it later if I need to. I had never changed it, and for the entire year since then, I had not once thought about it. Not because I was careless in general, but because no alarm had ever gone off, because life had been busy, because we had been together long enough that the idea of him secretly using a password I had forgotten I shared felt absurd, because trust is often just a series of small decisions you do not notice until one of them turns out to have been a bad one. My name is Natalie Okonkwo, and until that afternoon, I thought my biggest financial mistake was keeping too much money in a savings account, instead of moving more of it into investments. Then I learned my boyfriend had been using my own banking password, the one I had shared with him nearly a year earlier for a one-time favor, to quietly move money from my savings into his failing restaurant without ever asking me. Bennett and I had been together for a little over 4 years when this happened. We met through mutual friends at a birthday barbecue. He was funny in a way that seemed effortless, not performative, and he had one of those rare habits of actually listening while other people spoke. When he asked a question, it did not feel like he was just waiting for his turn to talk. He was warm, patient, and quietly ambitious. He had talked about opening a restaurant from the beginning, not some huge chain dream, but a place with good food, local ingredients, and the kind of atmosphere where people could come in after work and feel like they belonged. At the time, it sounded practical and romantic at once. He knew the business side. He had worked under 2 different chefs, managed back-of-house operations, and saved for years. He was not one of those people who announced a dream and then expected everyone else to finance it. He had spreadsheets, he had vendor contacts, he had a business plan. When he finally opened the place, I was proud of him in the way you are proud of someone you love when they take a leap. I helped him celebrate the launch. I posted about it. I invited friends to come eat there. I made sure to praise it in front of people who mattered to him because I believed in him. I also knew restaurants are brutal businesses. Even a good one can struggle in the beginning. The margins are thin. One bad week can turn into 3 bad weeks if rent, payroll, food costs, and vendor payments all land at the same time. Bennett talked openly about the pressure in the first year. Sometimes he came home exhausted and so preoccupied that he barely ate. Sometimes he would stand in the kitchen and stare into space like his body was present, but his mind was still downstairs in the dining room, counting tables and receipts. I did what partners do. I encouraged him. I listened. I celebrated small wins. I brought him coffee when he had early deliveries. I tasted new dishes. I helped him think through marketing ideas. Once or twice, when he had forgotten passwords for business tools, I helped him reset them because he was in a panic and I knew the system better than he did. It never occurred to me that this normal, supportive dynamic could be twisted into something predatory. When the bank alert came through, my first instinct was still to give him the benefit of the doubt. That was not because I was naive. It was because I desperately did not want to believe what the alternative meant. If Bennett had really used my password to take money from my savings, then this was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a betrayal that had been happening under my nose for months. I needed proof before I said the words out loud. I asked the bank for the login history associated with the transaction. The representative told me that some account access details could be reviewed, but to dispute the transfer properly, I would likely need to file a formal claim and possibly submit supporting documentation. I said I understood, though my hand had started shaking so badly I had to brace it against the desk. The bank sent me a partial record first, enough to show the time of access, the location, and the device pattern. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make the numbers become something else. The IP address matched Bennett's home internet connection. Not a nearby city, not some broad region. His actual connection. I read the line 3 times and then a 4th, because my mind kept wanting to replace the meaning of it with something less devastating. Maybe he had logged in from my apartment somehow. Maybe the bank system had glitched. Maybe the address was similar, not identical. But it was his connection, the same one we used whenever I worked from his place or streamed something after dinner. No hacker had slipped through from the outside. No stranger had guessed a password. Whoever had moved the money had sat in a place I knew, on a network I knew, and typed in my credentials. My throat went dry. For a few minutes I did nothing but sit there, phone in hand, staring out at the office parking lot. I could hear my coworkers talking somewhere near the break room, the normal sounds of paper, keyboards, and a microwave door opening and closing. The world kept moving in the ridiculous way it always does when something in your life has just split open. I wanted to call Bennett immediately. I didn't. The part of me that was still operating on logic knew I needed more than a sick feeling and an IP address before I confronted him. If I was wrong, I would destroy a relationship over an accusation I had not fully verified. If I was right, I still needed to know how far this went before I let him know I was on to him. So I called a lawyer instead. Her name was Priscilla Nakamura, and a coworker had once mentioned her in connection with a landlord dispute. I asked if she handled financial fraud or civil recovery issues. Her assistant said she did, and I had an appointment within 2 days. I spent those 2 days in a state I can only describe as controlled nausea. Bennett and I were still in a normal relationship on the surface. We texted about dinner. He asked whether I wanted to come by the restaurant on Friday. He complained about a supplier invoice that had gone up again. I responded like a person with a heartbeat and functioning social instincts, even though inside I was trying to assemble a timeline from scraps. He had mentioned a cash flow issue 6 weeks earlier, Then another one sometime after that, and I remembered him sounding increasingly stressed about vendor payments and staffing. At the time, I had assumed he was simply dealing with the kinds of temporary crunches that come with owning a restaurant. Now I found myself replaying those conversations with a new and much darker question in mind. When he said he had covered it somehow, what exactly had he covered? When he said, "I got it handled," had he actually been talking about my money? I kept my face steady whenever we spoke in person, but I stopped offering extra information. I stopped mentioning how much I had in savings. I stopped talking about a bonus I expected at work. I stopped saying anything that might sound like an invitation. It felt awful to suddenly become guarded around someone I had once trusted to hold my wallet while I ran into a store. Priscilla's office was downtown in a building with polished floors and very little decoration. She was calm in a way that immediately made me feel both safer and more ashamed of myself for being there. I told her everything from the beginning, about the password, the bank alert, the IP address, the relationship, the restaurant, the possibility that I had once carelessly opened a door and now could not close it. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she asked one simple question. "Do you want to know what the law can do, or do you want to know what the full truth is?" "Both," I said. She nodded like she had expected that answer. Priscilla explained that if the transfers had truly been made with my credentials, the bank might initially claim that the activity was authorized. However, if Bennett had accessed the account without my permission after I had shared the password for a separate limited purpose, there could still be grounds to challenge the legitimacy of the transfers. What mattered was documenting the pattern, the circumstances, and the scope. She recommended a forensic accountant named Cornelius Ackaby, someone who specialized in tracing money between accounts, uncovering patterns, and building a precise record of where funds had moved and when. If Bennett had used my savings account more than once, a trace would show it. That sentence landed like a warning and a verdict at the same time. I agreed immediately. Cornelius met me the following week at a modest office above a dry cleaner. He had the careful, patient energy of someone who spends a lot of time untangling other people's lies. He did not waste time with sympathy, which I appreciated. He asked me to explain the structure of my account, what access I had granted in the past, whether anyone else had ever known my password, and whether I had shared devices or security codes with Bennett. I answered everything as honestly as I could, even the embarrassing parts. Yes, I had helped him reset one of his restaurant logins before. Yes, I had once signed into a utility portal from his laptop because he was busy in the kitchen. Yes, I had shared my password a year ago for a one-time purpose and never changed it. Cornelius made a note without reacting. His expression did not change much at all, but I could tell by the way he tapped the page with his pen that he had already begun to see where this might lead. He told me the first thing he would do was reconstruct every outbound transfer from my savings account over the relevant period, then compare those dates with Bennett's restaurant records to see whether each transfer lined up with a known cash shortage. If there was a pattern, it would matter. If the transfers were small and occasional, that would matter too. The size and timing would show whether this had been opportunistic, planned, or desperate. It felt strange, sitting in a windowless office while a stranger treated my relationship like a financial crime scene. And yet that was exactly what it had become. The first few days of the investigation were surreal. I still went to work. I still answered emails. I still smiled at the right times when someone in the office told a story that wasn't funny. But the whole time I was waiting for Cornelius to call, and each hour stretched like a wire. Meanwhile, Bennett was being Bennett. He was affectionate in the way he always was when he felt overwhelmed, which meant he made more jokes than usual and touched the small of my back when he passed me in the kitchen. He complained about the price of produce and the state of his line cook schedule, and how one of his regular vendors was late again. He told me he appreciated that I was so steady while he dealt with the pressure of the restaurant. That sentence made me feel physically ill, because it sounded like gratitude, but it also sounded like justification. He was not asking me for money. He was not even hinting directly. If anything, he seemed to be using my emotional support as a shield. I remember one night in particular, he called me while I was in bed, sounding drained and angry in the low-controlled way he got when something had gone wrong in the kitchen. He said one of the equipment invoices had come due earlier than expected, and he might have to juggle payments again. I asked if he needed anything. He said no, just wanted to hear my voice. Then he thanked me for not making this harder. That phrase sat with me. Not making what harder? I stared at the ceiling after the call ended, wondering whether I had already been paying for his crisis in ways I did not understand. Cornelius called me 3 days later. He asked if I was somewhere private. I stepped into an empty conference room at work and closed the door. Then he told me he had reconstructed 4 separate transfers from my savings account into accounts connected to Bennett's business over an 8-month period. The total was just over $17,000. I had to sit down. I remember Cornelius continuing in the same even tone, telling me the dates, the amounts, the gap between transfers, and how each one aligned with a restaurant-related emergency. A supplier payment, a payroll shortfall, a kitchen repair, a tax-related cash issue that had been described to me previously only as a headache and something I'm handling. It was not one theft. It was a system. Each transfer had been timed after Bennett had complained about a specific stress point, and each one had been sent into a business account or linked payment channel. He had not asked me. He had not even told me. He had used my password like a hidden key and moved money when his own operation was under pressure. I thanked Cornelius, though I barely sounded human while I said it. When I hung up, I put both hands over my face and stayed that way long enough to scare a coworker who knocked on the door and asked if I was okay. I told her I had a migraine, which was true enough. That night I did not go to Bennett's place. I told him I had work to finish and wanted an early night, then sat alone in my apartment with the lights off and the legal folder Priscilla had given me spread out on the coffee table. There was something obscene about the ordinary objects around me while my life was being rearranged by theft. My mug, my blanket, the candle I had been meaning to light for weeks. Everything still belonged to the version of my world in which I believed my boyfriend was struggling, not stealing. I kept asking myself whether there had been signs. Had I ignored them because I wanted to be supportive? Had I mistaken secrecy for stress because I liked the story of us too much to question it? I remember the restaurant opening night. He had been sweating in the best possible way, rushing between the front door and the kitchen, proud and terrified all at once. I had kissed him in the parking lot and told him I believed in him. He had looked at me like I had handed him something precious. Now I wondered whether he had seen a financial safety net instead. The next morning, Bennett texted me 3 times before noon. "Where are you? Everything okay? You seem distant lately." There was no mention of money, no visible sign that he knew I had discovered anything. If anything, the messages made him sound concerned, even slightly worried. That worried me more than if he had been angry. Anger would have felt honest. Concern felt rehearsed. I did not answer right away. I met Priscilla again instead. This time she wanted the full trail of evidence from Cornelius, any bank records I had been able to download, and a timeline of my interactions with Bennett over the period in question. She told me to stop discussing finances with him until we had decided our next move, and she warned me not to accuse him by text before the documentation was in order. If he sensed the investigation, he could move money, destroy records, or prepare a story. So I said nothing. That restraint was harder than I expected. For almost a week, I continued seeing Bennett in a controlled, awful fog. He cooked dinner one night. He laughed at a ridiculous show with me on the couch. He leaned in and kissed my temple like we were the same 2 people we had always been. I found myself studying his face with a new horror, trying to detect something in his expression that would explain how he had done this. I did not find any obvious monster. That was the most unsettling part. He looked like the same man I had loved. He sounded like him. He moved through the apartment like him. The betrayal was not written on his face. It was hidden in the gap between what he presented and what he did when he thought I would never know. By the end of the week, Priscilla had enough to advise a formal dispute. She submitted the fraud claim with the bank, attaching the login history, the IP matching Bennett's home connection, and Cornelius's trace showing the repeated transfers. The bank did what banks do in these situations. It investigated, asked more questions, and moved slowly while my life remained on hold, because there was documented evidence that the password had been used from a known location that was not mine. The claim had real weight. It was not guaranteed, but it was strong enough to matter. During that waiting period, I needed to know the truth from Bennett himself. I was no longer interested in vague suspicion. I wanted to see whether he would lie to my face or admit what he had done when cornered with facts. I chose a Sunday afternoon because the restaurant was usually slower then, and because I knew he would not be in the middle of a dinner rush. I asked him to meet me at my apartment instead of his. He agreed immediately, which I now understand as either innocence or confidence. At the time, I could not tell which. He arrived with a bottle of wine and a takeout container of dumplings, smiling the way he always did when he wanted to smooth over tension before it existed. "You sounded serious on the phone," he said. I did not invite him to sit down right away. I stood by the table with Priscilla's paperwork in a neat stack, and Cornelius's summary report clipped on top. My hands were cold. I remember being annoyed by that, as if my body had chosen the wrong day to fail me. "I got a fraud alert from my bank," I said. His face changed only slightly. Just enough for me to notice that he understood the direction of the conversation before I finished speaking. He set the wine down carefully. "What kind of fraud alert?" "A transfer out of my savings." That got his attention fully. He asked whether someone had hacked my account. I looked at him and said, very evenly, "The bank traced the login. The IP address matched your home internet connection." The room went completely still. He stared at me without speaking, and I realized how much can be communicated in silence when someone is trying to decide whether to continue lying. Then he did what guilty people often do first. He denied it. "Natalie, that can't be right." I handed him the report. He read it. I watched his eyes move down the page. At first he kept his expression under control. Then I saw it shift, not into confusion, but into panic. He kept reading as if more information might magically appear that would save him from what was already there. "I can explain," he said. That was the moment I knew the explanation would not be good. I sat down because standing suddenly felt impossible. He started talking too quickly, which is always a bad sign. He said the restaurant was in a rough patch. He said he had not wanted to worry me. He said he thought it would be temporary. He said he intended to put the money back. He said he was under pressure, desperate, exhausted, and trying to keep the business alive. I let him talk for a minute, maybe two. Then I asked him one question. "Did you ask me?" He did not answer immediately. That silence was the answer. He finally said no, but he said it in the tone of someone trying to minimize the meaning of the word. No, because he had not thought it necessary. No, because he believed it would have been a conversation, and he did not think there was time for a conversation. No, because he knew I would have said no if he had asked, and he did not know what else to do. He moved from denial to rationalization with remarkable speed. He said the restaurant had been bleeding money for months. He said he had been waiting for a big supplier payment to come through, or for a better season, or for the investor conversation to resolve. He said he had thought one transfer would be enough. He said the first one had felt like borrowing. He said after that he was trying to stabilize things before telling me. He said he would have confessed eventually. Eventually. That word made my skin crawl. Because eventually is where people hide when they know what they have done is indefensible. I asked him whether he remembered the exact moment he realized he could use my password. He looked away. He said he had been desperate one night after a vendor threatened to cut off deliveries. He had been at the kitchen desk, staring at invoices, and thought about how I had once given him my login during a harmless favor. It had occurred to him that he still remembered it. He said he had told himself it was an emergency, that the restaurant employed people who depended on him, that if he lost the business he would lose everything. "So you thought my savings were your emergency fund?" I said. He winced, but he did not deny it. He started crying then, not loudly, but with the kind of frustration that comes when someone is confronted with the fact that their survival story has turned into a theft story. He said he never meant to hurt me. He said he loved me. He said he had been ashamed every time he did it, which I believe is true and irrelevant at the same time. Shame does not return stolen money. Shame does not make permission appear retroactively. I asked him why he kept doing it after the first transfer. He looked devastated when I asked that, which is the part I will never forget, because devastation there was not the same thing as accountability. He said the first transfer only covered one crisis, then another problem came up, then another. He had thought the restaurant would recover faster. It did not. Each time there was a new hole, he had told himself it was only this once. Each time, it got easier to reach for the password and harder to admit he had no clean way out. That answer made me feel colder, not warmer, because it confirmed what Cornelius had shown. This was not one bad moment. It was a repeated choice. I told him to leave. He did not argue at first. He just sat there, staring at the floor like he might find the version of himself he wanted to explain away. Then he asked if we could talk again after I cooled off. That made me laugh once sharply, because it sounded so absurdly normal, as if he had merely been late to dinner and not siphoned off $17,000 from my savings. "You don't get to tell me to cool off," I said. "You stole from me." He flinched at the word stole. I repeated it. He stood up slowly and tried one last time to soften the damage. He said he could pay it back. He said he would sign anything. He said he would sell equipment if he had to. He said he knew he had broken my trust, but the restaurant was his life's work, and he had panicked. I told him the restaurant was not the issue. The issue was that he had looked at my savings account, my safety, my planning, and my future, and decided he could spend them if his business needed the help. He left with the wine and the dumplings still untouched. I locked the door behind him and then sank to the floor and cried so hard I thought I might be sick. Not because I was surprised anymore, but because hearing him say it out loud made the reality final. The next several weeks were a blur of paperwork, calls, and the humiliating necessity of proving to an institution that the person I had trusted had taken advantage of me. Priscilla handled the bank communications and made sure every statement was supported by documentation. Cornelius's report showed the transfer pattern with brutal clarity. The bank eventually accepted that the circumstances warranted fraud recovery treatment for part of the amount. Not all of it. Banks are rarely generous in ways that feel proportionate to the emotional damage involved. But enough of the funds were recovered through the fraud protection process to make a real difference. That helped, but only in the narrowest financial sense. The rest was still gone, and even the returned portion did not erase what had happened. I also made Bennett sign a repayment agreement for the amount not recovered through the bank. Priscilla drafted it in a way that would hold up if he tried to disappear or stall. There were payment dates, default terms, and records of what remained owed. I did not want his promises. I wanted something enforceable. He signed it without much resistance. I think he knew resistance would only make him look worse, and he was already standing in the ruins of his own choices. We tried, for a short while, to have practical conversations about logistics. Not about the relationship, because that was already over even before I fully admitted it to myself, but about the transfers, the amounts, the repayment structure, and the fact that he needed to stop treating my account like a backup line of credit. He said he understood. He said he accepted responsibility. He said every apology he could think of. None of it changed my decision. Trust is not repaired by somebody finally admitting the truth after they have been caught. The relationship ended because there was nothing left to protect once I knew he had been willing to take what I had not offered. Breaking up with him was, in some ways, easier than the days leading up to it. Once the paperwork started, the emotional ambiguity faded. I no longer had to wonder whether I was imagining things. I no longer had to balance affection against evidence. I no longer had to pretend that love could make theft smaller. What I did have to do was sit with the uglier aftermath. People around me wanted to know what happened, and I told only a few of them the full truth. Some were shocked. Some were angry on my behalf. One friend immediately said she would have gone to the police. Another asked whether I had really forgotten a password for that long, in a tone that suggested the mistake was nearly as bad as the betrayal. That question bothered me more than I expected, because it exposed how easily people look for a way to divide blame evenly when one person has clearly crossed a line. Yes, I had been careless with the password. Yes, I should have changed it. Yes, that was a vulnerability. But a vulnerability is not permission. Forgetting to revoke access does not become consent for someone else to exploit it. I had made a mistake. Bennett had made a decision. Priscilla later told me that in her experience, a lot of financial abuse begins not with a dramatic act, but with exactly this kind of opportunity. A partner sees a shared account, a remembered password, a saved device, a flexible boundary, and convinces himself that the temporary use of something private is not really a violation, because the relationship itself feels like a justification. The danger is that once that line is crossed, it is very easy to cross it again. Cornelius said something similar when he gave me his final summary. He told me shared banking access between partners is especially dangerous, because the access often persists long after the reason for it has vanished. A one-time convenience can become a permanent vulnerability if nobody formally resets the boundary. Most people never think to revoke a password after a relationship has moved on from the moment that created the need for it. They assume the social bond will protect them. It does not. The bond is precisely what makes the access easier to exploit. I changed every password after that, not just the bank account. Everything: email, cloud storage, shopping logins, work-adjacent accounts, streaming services. I enabled two-factor authentication everywhere it was available. I reviewed recovery emails. I checked which devices were logged in. I changed security questions. I removed old phone numbers and reset saved credentials on devices I barely used. I made a spreadsheet because after what happened, my distrust became systematic. At first it felt dramatic. Then it felt necessary. I also began looking differently at all the small conveniences I had once treated as harmless. The way a couple shares a tablet. The way someone remembers a PIN. The way one person logs into something just this once because the other is busy. Those are not automatically bad things, but they are not innocent just because they feel intimate. Convenience is a doorway. You need to know when to close it. For a while, I had trouble sleeping in my own apartment because every sound made me think of a notification. I kept checking my phone at night. I started associating the bank app with dread. Even after the fraud claim was accepted, the sight of the balance made my chest tighten because I could still feel the absence of what had been taken. There is a strange grief that comes with theft from someone you loved. You are not only mourning the money, you are mourning the person you thought you knew. In the weeks after the breakup, I found myself remembering tiny moments that had looked ordinary at the time. The way Bennett had once asked, almost jokingly, whether I ever kept cash in the house. The way he sometimes seemed overly interested when I mentioned my bonus cycle. The way he had reacted a little too quickly once when I said I planned to move more money into savings. Maybe those were innocent. Maybe they were not. That uncertainty was part of the damage, because betrayal rewrites memory. It turns every harmless moment into something you have to re-examine for hidden meaning. The restaurant itself continued operating, though not in the way Bennett had hoped. Several staff members left over the following months. He had to scale back parts of the menu. He eventually admitted to me that he had been in worse financial shape than I realized, though by then the admission no longer created relief. It only confirmed that he had chosen secrecy over partnership when his business began to collapse. I did not become responsible for saving him from the consequence of his own choices. That was another lesson I had to learn. Once the repayment agreement was in place, I limited contact to what was strictly necessary. Most communication went through Priscilla or in writing. Bennett tried a few times to send emotional messages, usually late at night, saying he was sorry, saying he missed me, saying he had ruined the best thing in his life. I did not answer those. I had already heard enough to know that regret and repair are not the same thing. The money was eventually repaid in part through a combination of the bank recovery and Bennett's payment schedule, though not nearly fast enough to feel satisfying. The principle mattered more to me than the pace, because what I needed most was the proof that he could no longer reach into my life and take without consequence. I also had to confront the embarrassment of the whole thing. That part is harder to admit than the anger. It is one thing to be hurt. It is another thing to admit that you were hurt in a way that came from your own trust and your own failure to tighten a boundary. I hated telling people I had forgotten to change a password for nearly a year. I hated hearing how I should have been more careful. I hated that a mistake I made gave someone else a weapon. But eventually I came to understand that shame is often the last thing standing between a victim and their own clarity. I had made an error. Bennett had exploited it. Both things could be true, but only one of them was the betrayal. Months later, when the dust had settled enough for me to breathe without feeling like I was counting receipts in my head, Priscilla checked in and asked how I was holding up. I told her I was doing better than I had been. She said that made sense. I asked her whether cases like mine were common. She said more common than people think. That answer bothered me, but it also helped me understand why so many people get trapped in these situations. Nobody likes to imagine a partner secretly using their credentials. Nobody likes to think the person beside them is capable of treating access like entitlement. And because it feels so invasive, people often delay looking too closely until the evidence is already overwhelming. If there was one thing I would tell another woman in my position, it would be this: do not confuse shared comfort with permanent permission. If you shared a password for a one-time reason, change it. If someone had access to your device, revoke it. If your gut tells you to check a login history, check it. If a bank alert makes no sense, do not let embarrassment stop you from demanding the details. I learned that because of Bennett, and I hate that I had to. I also learned that the hardest part of betrayal is not always the loss itself. It is the way it forces you to rebuild your sense of reality from scratch. You look at your past and realize you can no longer trust your own assumptions about what was happening while you were standing right there. Even now, when I think about the first fraud alert, I can still feel that strange split second between confusion and recognition. The moment when my mind tried to protect me from the truth by pretending there must be another explanation. The moment before I saw the IP address and everything became clear. That was the moment my old life ended. What came after was paperwork, accountability, resentment, relief, and a very deliberate rebuilding of my boundaries. I learned how to protect my accounts better. I learned how to recognize when someone is framing their selfishness as necessity. I learned that I was desperate is not the same as I was allowed. Most of all, I learned that a relationship can look stable right up until the moment you discover one person has been quietly treating the other person's private life like shared property. I will never forget the feeling of hearing the bank representative say the transfer had been authorized with my own password. I will never forget opening the trace report and seeing the transfers lined up across 8 months like evidence in a case I never wanted to have. And I will never forget the look on Bennett's face when he finally understood that I was not asking for a confession anymore. I was presenting him with the truth. That truth cost me a relationship I thought was solid, a stretch of peace I had taken for granted, and enough money to make me rethink everything I believed about convenience and trust. But it also gave me something I had not had before, a permanent respect for how quickly a small boundary violation can turn into financial damage if you ignore it. Now, every time I create a new password, I remember why. Every time a site offers to save my login, I decline. Every time a partner or friend asks for access to something private, I pause and decide whether there is a real reason for it or just a moment of convenience. And if the reason is temporary, I treat it like what it is: temporary. Because that one lesson, learned the hard way, cost me enough already.